So, as we're reading through this book, I think the thing that was most surprising to me was the philosophical discussion of nudist colonies. I was not expecting any discussion of nudist colonies, and then it got so philosophical, and I was like, wow, this was a very unexpected turn from this book. Turn pages? Okie dokie. That's where we're going with this one. So anyway, as we get started with all of this, I'm basically following the structure of the chapter, and then the areas where I had something to add or thought that he threw an idea out there, and then it's like, that's a big idea that he did not elaborate on. I'll try and explain some of those ideas, but he touched on so many things, including nudist colonies. I couldn't possibly unpack all of it in just 45 minutes, and so that's kind of why you read the book, you do the homework, we have the conversation, we have the small groups. So you have this very holistic process to process through the ideas and have a context to ask more questions afterwards and everything like that. But with all that said, as you are well aware, the class is called Christian Story, in which case we're trying to look at the Christian story. So you understand, you're tracking along with what we're doing here. But basically, you think about, if you're brand new to church, you've probably still heard a lot of Bible stories, but with no context. And even if you've been in church your whole life, you've probably heard a lot of Bible stories. And even if you've read through the entire Bible, as we talked about last week, it was written over about 1,500 years. We've got like 40 authors, multiple languages. It's not chronological. It's not one genre. So even if you read it, like sit down and in 1 month, read it cover to cover, you can still be like, okay, I know a lot more. I got a lot more information. I still don't get that line that runs through the whole thing exactly. That's kind of what this course is all about. Trying to give you that through line. Because so often you hear sermons and they're just like, you have got like a ballpark idea of where it falls. Like, okay, New Testament. Back third. Old Testament. Okay, that could be a lot of different places. But when especially you get into the prophets and everything, they're so dense. There's so much in there. So we want to help you understand how it kind of falls together. You think, like, if you're watching a movie, you don't start in the middle. And if you do, you'll probably be pretty confused. Remember when I was in high school one time, I went to a friend's house, and he was in the middle of watching this movie called Akira. And I walk in, and a teddy bear starts walking towards a guy, and then he punches the teddy bear, and milk starts pouring out of the teddy bear. And then in the next scene, a gigantic amoeba attacks Tokyo. Then I rewatched it from the beginning. It didn't make any more sense. So maybe that's a bad example. But like, just when you watch it like that, like, what on earth is going on? And even as I'm saying it, you're guys like, what is this guy talking about? More relevant example, a few years back, this movie called Avengers Endgame came out. And it was the culmination of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's the 22nd movie in this gigantic franchise. And at the time, I was delivering paint for a living, and my kind of supervisor, co-delivery guy, his name is Hector, and I just delivered some paint. I showed up back at the paint store, and he's like, oh, the Avengers Endgame trailer dropped. Oh, wow, that's cool, man. What was in it? He goes, yeah, I have no idea what was going on. Like, everybody was dead, and that was what the starting point. I didn't understand what was going on. I was like, well, did you see the last movie that came out? No. When was the last movie you saw? Like, I don't know, like Iron Man? Dude, Iron Man came out 2008, 10 years ago. What? You haven't seen anything since then? Like, no. Like, well, yeah, you won't understand this one if you skipped over everything beforehand. And that's kind of the experience that most people in church world have. That you just hear these sermons and it's Jesus without the context of the Old Testament. It's Jonah without the context of the Old Testament. Like, wherever it's at, you have an idea, but it's that strong through line. So we want to give you that. So every time you hear a sermon, you know where to put it. You know how it fits in the big story. You know how to categorize it. And so every sermon you hear, when you know where to put it, you get a lot more out of it. It's a lot easier to remember something that's in a context rather than just kind of like, okay, I don't know exactly what this is. And so that's what we're really hoping that you'll get out of that. And for today, we are starting at the very beginning, as you probably should start with a story. It normally helps to start at the beginning. And considering the length of how many lessons we're doing for this and how big the Bible is, today we are only looking at 2 chapters of the Bible, which should tell you just how important these 2 chapters are for establishing where everything else goes and establishing the Christian worldview. So with that said, we're kind of tracking along with what's in the, that's not the one, this one, okay. Tracking along with your stuff. And so first thing we kind of looked at was what was created on each day. I did a simplified version. If you want to, I don't think it literally says that God took a nap, but it's a little bit more fun to think about God taking a nap on the seventh day. So that's what I said in there. But you just got to think through. It gives us the outline of the days of creation. And this is already in your homework, so there's not much to write down at the moment. But the kind of the first question that he starts to explore with this is this idea of, are the days literal? And I don't feel like this has been as big of a conversation over the last 20 years, but I remember back in the 90s when I was growing up, this was much more of a topic of conversation of like, is the earth 4,000 years old? Is it 4,004 years old? Is it 6,000 years? Or are these metaphoric days? And that seemed to be what so many books were written about, and so much of the arguments were about, is it meant to be strictly literal in your interpretation of these days? And there's guys that they took the Bible and they went, okay, now if you add up every genealogy and you go through the whole Bible and you add them up, and they tried to get the exact precise age of the earth, which when the Bible was written, they certainly weren't thinking about the fact that I bet 3,000 years from now, some guy's going to sit down and try and add this up to figure out the exact day that everything took place. So he pauses for a little bit to have kind of this conversation about, are the days literal days? How symbolic are they? And superficially speaking, if you just read through it, it looks like he's saying day 1, day 2, day 3. Our definition of day is 24 hours. And so strictly looking at that, superficially speaking, you look over it, reads like 7 literal days. And then at the same time, if you look at all scientific knowledge that we have, everything we've advanced, looking at the scientific data, it looks like the universe is quite a bit older than 4,000 years old. And so that creates a tension of like, okay, this seems to say one thing. The intellect that God gave us has advanced us to a point where we've come to be able to observe the universe on a very detailed level, and it seems to indicate something that conflicts with this if you take them at face value in the most literal senses. Once again, do I think that all of this was meant to be read in this strictly, like, let's add it up to figure out the exact moment? I don't think that that's what they were thinking when they wrote the Bible at the time. That way of thinking of like, let's look at the most technical, literal sense. We talked about postmodernism, modernism last week just a little bit. That way of thinking is modernism. That it's not really a biblical worldview, though a lot of times one's compatible to it in certain ways. But that sort of way of thinking, it isn't really reading the Bible the way that it was intended. And I think the book discusses this, the way he... Where do I point? There. There we go. I thought he phrased it really nicely in the book. He said, I hold that the Genesis account is a mixed genre that feels like a history. If you read it, this doesn't feel like it's just an allegory. It doesn't read like it's just a metaphor. It reads like a history and really does give us some historical particulars. There's specific days, it's chronological, it ties to things. And at the same time, however, it is fully demonstratable symbolism. Sorting out what is symbolic and what is not is very difficult. I thought that's phrased really nicely. Like, yeah, clearly it's meant to be read as a history. You're supposed to take this as truth. It's not just a metaphor. It's not just symbolic. But if you just step back and think about it, there's a bunch of things in here that they're symbolic. Case in point, what is a day? What is a day literally? 24 hours based off of what? Yeah, rotation of the earth in relation to the sun. When was the earth created in the creation account? Not the first thing created. So you go, wait a minute. When is the sun created? Day 4. So the point of reference for what a day is created after a day is referenced. So in which case you immediately go, okay, did God, to make sure that it's most strictly literally true, may have an exact 24-hour day time period where he created on day one. Okay, that probably doesn't make it, that seems like an overly literal interpretation of what it says. Likewise, it says God said. Our definition of said is I breathe air into my lungs, and then through my vocal cords, something's articulated. Like, that's what that means, literally. Do I think that that's exactly what happened? No. But does this indicate the truth of what God is trying to communicate something to us, that to us, how can all people at all time, the Bible's written to all people at all time, how can we understand what God's creation was? Our reference point for time is days. A reference point for the idea of he just did it, he just said it, is saying that he spoke it into existence. So I think that's where, going back to the kind of the quote of, he's telling the history, he's telling us how it worked, but also a bunch of it is clearly symbolic at the same time. Which, I couldn't tell you exactly. But I think that's talked about when I was in Bible college, this idea of trying to live within the biblical tension. And kind of going, this is absolutely true. And then at the same time, God didn't lie to us with creation. He didn't deceive us with creation. He didn't give us an intelligence that will lead us to like totally wrong conclusions. And so how do you live within that biblical tension and holding both to be true? That God gave us an intelligence to be able to observe the universe and that communicates things, and that God's word is absolutely true. But we can misinterpret either one of these as fallen creatures. So trust God's word. And the key thing in all of it, the most important detail in all of this, is God did it. God guided it. God was the one driving everything that happened for his purposes. It's not a deistic worldview. It's like, yeah, God created the Big Bang and then he took a nap. No. God was in charge of everything that took place, every step all along the way, guiding us to where we're at for his purposes. And so then in the book, it kind of goes into this discussion about...
Pretty good.
Oh, went too far. There we go. Intelligent design. And this is one of the ones where the book, I felt like he dropped all these big terms, referenced a bunch of books, and then moved on really quickly. And it's like, okay, I have a degree in Bible, so I read a couple of these books you referenced and had to write a bunch of papers on some of these things you talked about. But if I'm just reading this without that context, you moved really quickly talking about some very dense ideas. And so I'm going to drop even more dense ideas on you, so I don't know that I'm going to help any. But so he's talking, this key idea is that God did it. God did it. So how do we start to try and reconcile our understanding of the world with kind of certain scientific discovery? And what are some of the conversations being had about science and the Bible? And kind of the current way that's kind of being articulated largely is through something called intelligent design. And some people just said it's a new version of creation science and things like that. And it's not really. It's looking at what, basically the idea is, through everything we now know about the way evolution kind of played out, if you look at all of these things in creation, they don't line up with the evolutionary model. There's too many things that are too complex to follow the idea that they just happened. It looks like something was designed, and the specific idea that he drops in there's irreducible complexity, which we'll talk about just a second. But intelligent design is basically a modern articulation of a very old philosophical idea, the teleological argument for God. It goes back thousands of years, that simply put, if you look at creation, it looks like it was designed. You wouldn't come across this creation and go, well, that looks like a big accident. That, like, you just wouldn't do that because there's so many complex parts that the idea that it would randomly reach this moment in time where I have this piece of technology that I point at Trey, and then that computer, which is all sorts of digital things no one in this room can explain, then puts an image on this TV, which maybe someone in the room can kind of explain how a TV works, but they're so complex. The idea that all of this is just a really long series of accidents seems pretty ridiculous, and it seemed pretty ridiculous to humans for a very long time. So that's the fun name. If you're at a party and you want to like impress people with your intelligence level, you say that reference the teleological argument for the existence of God. The more common way that it's kind of been phrased over the last several years is the illustration of the watchmaker. If you're walking along a beach and you find a stopwatch in the sand, no one would think, I bet that is just like a weird series of coincidences that some sand got superheated and turned into glass, and there was some metal in the ocean from a can, and it got wrapped up and it turned into these gears, and then they crashed together in the waves, and then it got thrown onto the beach, and it looks like no one would think that. No one would ever think that this was an accident. You would see it and immediately go, that was created by someone. There's some watchmaker. And the simple fact of the matter is there's too many different pieces that are highly specific that go together. So you think about the idea of a screw, you have to have these grooves both on the screw itself and on the thing that it goes into. And so the idea that both of them would form so perfectly to go together is, of course, ludicrous. That would be coincidentally to fall together, and coincidentally the wave crashed them together and turned in just the right way that it went. Like, of course, that's ridiculous. So anyone that would see a watch would go, there's a watchmaker. Then naturally you apply that to creation, and once again, this is really complex. And especially you think about humans with brains. These incredibly powerful, super organic, moist computers in our heads that can just store images going way back, calculate things. It's a nice little phrase. But, you always figure out which people don't like the word moist whenever you say, who starts squirming. So, but you think about how complex and strange the human brain is, that what it's able to do, and able to create computers to do all these things. The idea that it's just a series of accidents, you go, that doesn't feel right. That at face value, that does not seem like the way that would work out. And the phrase for this that he dropped in there, but he doesn't fully dive into, is irreducible complexity. And the concept of irreducible complexity is basically you have all of these complex things in nature that the classic example is an eye. That an eye doesn't work until everything's complete. So the idea that you have millions of years of evolution forming to an eye doesn't add up, because for millions of years it doesn't do anything. It doesn't work. You have all of these different parts that have to be completed. And if one of them's not complete, the thing doesn't function. And so then you wouldn't continue down this evolutionary path unless there's someone that's guiding all of this. There's someone that's behind all of this. That's the idea of intelligent design. And that's the problem of irreducible complexity, where you have these things that it doesn't work until it's all there. So the mechanism of Darwin and survival of the fittest doesn't work to explain so much of nature unless there's a God guiding everything that's taking place. So kind of back to what we said at the beginning of this, whatever you believe about creation, the key thing is God did it. God guided it. God was driving it. God had a purpose for all of it. It was all about God. He's the one that made it happen. So then, kind of get into the section where it talks about God revealing himself. All right, the things we learn about God through creation. And so I just kind of put them all up here, and I'll pause on some of these just a little bit. So one of the big ones is that God simply is. When you stop and think about it, every worldview, whatever you believe, you either believe something is self-existent or self-creating. And either one of those are very weird concepts, because we know everything that is has been created. Like, it had to come from somewhere. So the idea that there's something that's self-existent is a very weird concept that I kind of feel like every worldview is weird if you stop and think about it. Even Christian worldview, stop and think about it, there's a God that's always existed. You go, that's weird that he cares about me. That's pretty weird. Do you think about the idea of like secular evolution? Well, for some reason, matter just existed, and then it exploded, And then a long time later, we have computers and human brains. Well, that's a weird thought. That doesn't make any sense. So you think at the end of the day, like, as soon as you get to the point where you start thinking about the fact that something has to be self-existent, it gets complex. But so the idea is God simply is. Nothing created God, and God created everything. He's self-existent. He's always been. And one of the ideas about this, that by definition, God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end. By definition, God is self-existent. That's the definition of God. And so as soon as you have a worldview of like, if you say that, oh, matter is self-existent, matter's just always existed. Well, like this is matter, I'm matter. I've always existed. I mean, not organized like this. But you start thinking about it, like it's a really strange thought that matter just existed when everything that we know about matter says that it has to be formed and shaped. Like they just created out of nowhere. Doesn't add up. So the idea of God built into the concept is that he is above our understanding of everything. He is that thing that by definition can be self-existent. So that's what God simply is. Second one, God made everything. And then once again, if you want to kind of impress people at parties with your knowledge of Latin, it's ex nihilo, from nothing. I don't know what parties you're at where that would come up, but that's always been my argument for learning phrases like that, to try and impress people. That never works, but I always try it. But ex nihilo, God made everything from nothing. And the big idea is that it's not that God was there and there was stuff and he reorganized it into creation. The idea is there was only God. And then he snapped. Then he breathed. And it's just there. He just did it. He created everything. He was self-existent and he created everything. And this is one where we have a lot of ancient texts from around the time the Bible was written, and some people try to draw comparisons to the Bible and Babylonian texts and things like that. And one of the gigantic differences is that in the Bible, in Christian theology, God created everything from nothing. Whereas in so many other texts, there was stuff there, and then they reorganized it. And fundamentally different from them, in Christian theology, God created everything from nothing. Another one on here, there is only one God. Another thing that just distinguishes Christianity from so many other religions, it's that there's one God. Now that God is complex, that oneness is not a simple oneness. There's a lot to explain about it, but God is one. Next one, God talks. And I simplified some of these in my notes. I was pulling from what I wrote in here, but I have terrible little kid handwriting and I write gigantic letters, so I couldn't fit into the spaces. So some of these I had to simplify from what's actually in the book. God talks. So simply put, in there it says God spoke and it happened. And then as we move into the next chapters, God continues to communicate with mankind. He gives commands to mankind. And the important detail on this, once again, is that this is an adeistic God that's separate. It's not that he's like, let me do a cool experiment. Ta-da! Let me just watch. From the very beginning, he's involved. He has opinions on what we're going to do, how we live our lives. But he's a communal God. He wants to communicate with us. That's built in from the very beginning. God talks, God listens, God is paying attention. Next one, creation is good. Once again, this is important for where we're about to go. A little bit at the end of this talk and a lot of it next week's talk. We see the image of what God wanted creation to be, what it was supposed to be. It gives us the standard by which to know when we get off from the standard. So, whole Bible is a redemptive story. What are we redeeming back to? Genesis 1 and 2. And so God looks at his creation, the harmony of it. It was good. He looks at mankind in his image. Very good. That is the goal. That is what we're trying to get back to. It says, God finished and rested. So there was a creation act that was completed, and then he rested. So that's just to say that there was a point in time that he stopped the creation process. And then the last one on here, and where we'll kind of linger for a little bit, God's creation proclaims God's glory. It's all about his glory, displaying who he is, his greatness. And that'll tie us into our next discussion that is essentially a continuation of that, which is the image of God. Image of God. And where mankind starts to get into the picture here And it says in Genesis 1, then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In his own image he created him. Male and female he created them. There's verse 31, he saw all that he made, and it was very good. Here's where we're kind of going with all this. When God creates everything, he treats mankind differently and designs us in a way in which we are the image of God. So what exactly does that mean? Well, the Hebrew words used there are teslim and demet. Now, don't go up to a party and say those words to someone that speaks Hebrew, because you will mispronounce them, because I have no idea how to say them properly. But the word teslim, one of them, the one for image, it's a word used all throughout the Old Testament for like statues. So it's used in like 1 Samuel 6:5 for a statue of mice, Ezekiel 23:14, a painting of soldiers. So like artistic works. That's what this word is used for. So when God does his artistic work in creation, his self-portrait when designing the world, like God's going to condescend himself to this creation. What's the thing that could kind of be a representation of him in this world? And that's what mankind is. And then the other word, demet, likeness, it emphasizes similarity even more. We're similar. Obviously, we are not God. Obviously, we are this shrunken down version, condescended into the boundaries and rules of this reality that we exist in. But in a unique way, as the book says, we are the reflection of God in creation. We are the metaphor for God in creation. God's self-portrait, distinctly different. Once again, why does God create everything? For the purpose of displaying his glory. And then he creates mankind as the ultimate version of that, of what you can do in this creation to reflect who he is. And he sees it, and it's very good. And to get a little bit ahead of ourselves for future weeks, like, why is sin such a problem? Like, what is sin? Well, if we're designed to be the image bearers of God, sin means to miss the mark. It's like an archery term. That's the mark, and we're supposed to hit that. Sin is to miss the mark. The mark, the target, is to be an image bearer of God. Live in God's image. That is what we're supposed to do. And when we sin, we get off from that. We fail to bear his image. Yes?
But are we, we're still image bearers?
Yes.
And so do you think that sometimes we get so wrapped up as humans, in almost this self-deprecating idea that humans are bad, we're bad, that we...
So the phrase that one of my professors used in Bible college was that the image of God has been defaced, but not erased. But to your point, you spend so much time talking about how we're sinners, and we spend so much time in a world filled with sinners that it's very easy to see that. And I basically do social media for a living, so I spend a bunch of time on Twitter, which is just a hive of sinners being horrible to each other. A bunch of people unable to see that other humans are humans and assuming the worst about them. And I think that's very true, that we spend so much time on the side to it of reminding ourselves of the sinfulness of man, and not enough time remembering every human, no matter who they are, how broken they are, how far they've gone, is an image bearer of God. And you use the craziest extreme example you can always use. Hitler was made in the image of God. That is a strange thought to think about when you have someone that did such vile, evil things, but he's still made in the image of God. And that should remind us just how sickening sin is, and how poisonous it is, how toxic it is, and how depraved and evil it can take us off the mark. And that's also one of the reasons why we want to talk about this, is to get back to the idea of reminding us constantly, everyone is made in the image of God. Everyone has incredible value, incredible potential, incredible dignity, because they're an image bearer of God. In some way, they are a reflection of God on this earth. They are God's self-portrait. as defaced as it might be. Back when I did versions of this talk in the day, my wife does a lot of painting type stuff. So we'd have her like paint paintings of Jesus on stage, and then when we'd get to sin it, someone would walk up and they would just throw paint on this painting. And everyone in the room would go, because they just, that's a really cool, and they're not even listening to me. They're just watching this painting. Gee, that's a really neat painting. And then throws paint on it, and you just hear the room go, But that's what every sin is. That's what every single sin is that we are God's self-portrait. But sin defaces God's masterpiece on this earth. And each and every one of us. And as much as we could beat ourselves up, there is that side to it of always, I'm made in the image of God. And that's the thing that if we could remind ourselves of that, have that tension of like, I am in the image of God and all this sin is that gross, that's when you really start seeing how amazing the act of Jesus is. Because that's the other thing, right, to get ahead of ourselves. Jesus is the ultimate example of an image bearer of God. Because he was fully human, fully God, and he actually hit the mark. He lived up to the standard. That's what it's supposed to look like, his life. That is the perfect version of the image of God on this earth. What it looks like to be condescended down to the human experience in perfectly being an image bearer of God in a fallen, sinful world. It's what Jesus did. And then likewise, what's the whole redemptive story about? It's about restoring that, cleansing us, and getting back to the image of God. And to kind of tie it all up as we kind of close out with my little teaching time. So it says, sorry, I have one of these two. There we go. So it says, verse 27. So God, and once again, making the point, God created everything for his glory. So God created mankind in his own image. In his image, he created them, male and female. And the very next verse gives us the first command in the Bible. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. So first off, a lot of people criticize Christianity, the Bible, for being killjoy, a bunch of rules, which is true. This is a command, but it's a pretty fun command if you stop and think about the implications of what God is commanding us to do in this verse. So right off the bat, commands us, be fruitful and multiply. But what does that mean? What are we multiplying? The image of God. Be fruitful, increase in numbers, fill the earth with the image of God. Whole purpose is to display his glory. We're the reflectors of his glory, and we're supposed to fill the earth with his image. Now, as we talked about, next week we're really going to talk about it. We're in a fallen world. And here we jump forward a long time. There's 8 billion people on the earth. It's pretty full. 8 billion image bearers on the earth right now that are sinners. But we've been given the message to take to people so that they can have redemption. They can be cleansed and have that image of God restored in them. You start to think through some of these verses that so drive us as a church. Habakkuk 2:14, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It's all about spreading the word of God and making people that are disciples of Christ, that have been cleansed, restored, and are image bearers once again. We're the reflectors. And when we live the way we're supposed to live as disciples, empowered by the Holy Spirit to live like him, we fill the earth with the knowledge of the glory of God as these image bearers. That's what this is all about. That's the Christian story. And that's what we're going to elaborate on over the next, I don't know how many weeks, but however many weeks there are in this course, that's what we're doing. All right, that's what I got for you. Trey, what do you have for us?